Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. Every podcast touches on both leadership and mental health and also provides specific next steps. And this podcast is still fairly new. I just started it last November. As I continue to get more guests and provide more content that helps you and your leadership team, if you could take just a minute and go over to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you're listening or viewing this, and just give me a rating and even leave a comment. The way the algorithms work, it just really helps this podcast get out to more people. For today's episode, I sat down with my friend Jared Scheppmann, and I've known him for almost 20 years. We were both invited into an internship program at a church in Las Vegas. At that point, I hadn't really spent much time outside of Kentucky and ended up driving across the country to start this internship, and that's where I met Jared. And through the years, we've been a part of each other's weddings and had families that have grown, and he's gone on to do some amazing work in Uganda, where he serves as the executive director for Akisa Ministries. He and his wife Stephanie and their boys, they live there, they serve there, and so we got a chance to sit down together again in Las Vegas, full circle, for a fundraising event for their ministry. And so I went out and supported them, but then also sat down for this conversation. I'm excited for you to hear from Jared. They are doing amazing work in the lives of people who are often discarded and overlooked.
Well, we've known each other for a while. We met here in Las Vegas. We actually got it.
We were in Vegas.
Pictured behind us. So this is my hometown, and we're here in a hotel room. And I don't live here anymore. I live in Uganda, Africa now. So my kind of journey, we met in the church world as interns starting off. I was finishing up Bible college and went into pastoral world at a church and did that for a few years and left. And
getting close to 20 years ago.
Man,
wild.
We're getting old. But transitioned into the nonprofit world and overseas ministry specifically. And somewhere in the middle of that, I got an MBA. And so the idea of, leadership was something that always interested me. It was I knew early on, it was one of the ways I was wired with, leadership and administrative gifts. And so, wanted to pursue that MBA to just help nurture that no matter where it was going to take me, and eventually took me into the nonprofit world. And so I live overseas. I work for a ministry over there called Akisa.
And then you're not alone over there. You've got some family as well. So
got a wife. It'll be 15 years this year, and 3 kiddos, 3 boys. They're all boy, young. They grow up in Uganda. Everyone was always asking, what's it like for your kids to grow up in Uganda? Most people don't know about Uganda, what it's like. When we think about Africa, it's is it the desert? Is it the jungle? Uganda's beautiful. I tell people it looks like Hawaii. It's green and lush, and there's rolling hills, and it's just a beautiful place to be. The weather's great. The people are just wonderful. It's such a warm, welcoming culture. And so we love living there, right? And it does have its challenges. We live overseas. We live in a country that is developing, and so there's a lot of differences. But the things that we love about it, offset those, and it's the place we've called home for almost 10 years now. So
we were at a fundraising event last night. It's the reason I'm out here and the reason you're here. And I know you shared before, while it is a developed country, it's still a third world country.
Yeah.
And so just the nuances there, and the challenges there, and also the Nile's in your backyard, you said, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, the Nile River's there. It's a beautiful thing. So you can just hop in a basket and float all the way up to Egypt.
That's biblical.
Biblical. So,
You tried it with your kids too, right?
One time.
Yeah.
But didn't make it. There's a few dams in the way.
Yeah.
So, as far as just living there in daily life, when you're a foreigner living in a new country, it comes with a lot of challenges. especially, for families trying to adjust, and we live in a city that it kind of feels like a small town. It's pretty big, but there's a large foreign population of expatriates and missionaries and people doing development and aid work. And so there's a lot of foreigners, and so that helps us with friendships and, cultural things that we can relate. We have Ugandan friends as well, but there's differences there, and it's hard to kind of navigate that. A lot of people, when they move, especially from a missionary perspective, if you're moving to a foreign country, you think okay, I'm gonna be a part and acclimate to this culture. But the reality is you kind of can't. You live in between both. There's actually a book for kids, and this really impacts children as well, because children, coming from one culture and then moving into another one, they kind of they live in both worlds, right? And they kind of acclimate to both, and they don't have that establishment of years of growing up in one country. And so they're being formed in both cultures. There's a book, it's called Swirly, and they talk about, this blue family that lives in the blue country, and then they move to the red country, and the kids would start to become purple, and so for us, where we kind of bounce around between blue and red, they're a little bit swirly. And with children though, one of the things the book kind of brings out is it can raise some of these issues of where do I belong? Where do I call home? I feel like I don't fit in here. I feel like I don't fit in there. But yeah, navigating some of that cultural stuff with friendships and just day-to-day life can be a little bit challenging. When you move to any new city, you go through that time period of trying to establish relationships, which can be challenging for people. But having those community hubs like churches and schools and those opportunities to where you can build relationships and friendships, it's very similar that you'll find living abroad. So yeah.
You're the executive director. It's kind of your title and from the leadership side of things. I'm always interested, when you step into leadership abroad, how to kind of gain influence, to win people, to get trust. What have you learned through any of that? I think anybody in leadership can resonate with maybe a new role you stepped into, a new company, and you're the new person and you're walking into a history of relationship and years of all these things that you could never get fully caught up on. Yeah. So I guess from your standpoint, stepping into a high-level position, what worked well for you to kind of gain that trust as quickly as possible?
Oh, man. I mean, a lot of similarities when you consider doing that in an American culture and moving into a new job versus internationally. I'd say the difference internationally, especially in a country like Uganda, where you have a history of colonization, when the new boss shows up to a new job anywhere, everyone's asking okay, who's the new guy? What do we think about him? Who's he going to be? A little bit of a trial period, for people to kind of determine who you are and if they can trust you and those things. Same thing for me moving into this position internationally, but I'd say a little bit of that hesitation is probably a little bit higher, just because coming in as a white person into a black country, and that history of whites and foreigners kind of over dominating influence and taking leadership positions and stuff like that. So a little bit of hesitation there. Not a big difference, but just you have to put more emphasis on this idea of trust, right? I love just the topic of trust as it relates to leadership. When I was doing my MBA, it was one of the things that as I started to study and read, and my MBA actually had an emphasis in leadership, so instead of focusing on finance and HR, I focused on leadership topics. I can't remember who said it, but, trust is a currency. And when you have a lot of it in the bank, you get some leeway, right? And this plays out in day-to-day lives, right? When you're close with a friend and your friend comes to you with a little bit of criticism or a little bit of critique, you're like, oh, and you listen to that person and it's okay, he has my best interest of heart. He wouldn't say this to me unless he really meant it. But if just some random guy on the street comes up to you, and critiques you and says, hey, you're a bad leader and you need to work on your communication skills, you'd be like, who are you? I don't know you from Adam. And it's the same idea that if you have to build trust, and you build trust through relationship, and it's essential you have to have that currency, because if people don't trust you, they won't follow you, or you'll drag them along. As I was transitioning kind of into this job, I had read a book during my MBA program called The Leadership Challenge, and I went back and reread it. And it's one of my favorite leadership books I recommend to people all the time because it really kind of is super helpful to anyone who's stepping into a new position at a new company. Anyone who's coming in as an outsider, you come with fresh eyes, right? And so you can quickly identify, hey, this is working well, this is not working well. And like, that's a blessing as a new leader coming into an organization. But when you come in and you have not established trust, and you start to bring in some of those changes, like no matter how warranted and necessary they are, people will get defensive and people will not like you because we do things the way that we do it, right? This is how we've always done it, and you're coming in and screwing it up. And then you're just creating tension and burning bridges. And so establishing trust and the idea of kind of co-evaluation and co-brainstorming in what needs to be addressed and changed within the organization was a huge aspect for me bringing into it, which worked out really well. Like, I'm so grateful I read that book, that really helped me to come in really well to our organization.
You may have not lasted 7 years there if you operated differently. And trust is huge, and the Leadership Challenge is an incredible book. I think of even some of Lencioni's work with the absence of trust in an organization. A lot of times a key indicator of if trust is missing is if you're starting to see artificial harmony.
Yeah.
When you're walking in a meeting and people are talking and people really aren't giving their real 100% input, and then they walk out of there and they go to their trusted person and they kind of gossip here,
it's
they gossip
the
there.
meeting after the meeting.
The meeting after the meeting, or the text after the meeting. It's like that artificial harmony. And so any kind of lasting, you talk about something that kills culture, artificial harmony.
Oh, yeah.
And so starting with trust, I love that you kind of offered that, and that makes so much sense to me. I'm fascinated in always how high-level leaders navigate the role, but then also the family. How do you strike a semblance of balance in that world as you're in your role?
I mean, just the topic of work-life balance, again, I tell everyone I'm very blessed because the church that I came from, I would say is pretty non-typical when it came to work-life balance. Most people who are in ministry in the church, in the American church, are overworked. And there's this go. And the church that I came for, the senior pastor kind of had this mantra of work hard, rest hard. And so when you're here, work, do your stuff, get it done. And then when you go home, go home. And we had 2 days off. And that's kind of a rarity in a lot of churches. We had 2 days off. We had PTO days and personal days to take off, and a sabbatical system every 7 years. And so it's kind of built into the culture there. And so I from that, I learned the importance of that. And so really carried that and tried to champion that as I transitioned into Akisa. And again, it's simply a choice, because at the end of the day, the work and the needs are always going to be too many. When you're doing ministry work, so much so in the work that we do, we work with children with disabilities, and the needs are unfathomable. And it's this thing where it just pulls at you, and there's always something that could be done, and there's always one more kid to help, and there's always a need, and there's always a staff member who needs something. And there has to be a discipline, there has to be a choice, and there has to be a recognition of, hey, I'm not God. I am not the Savior. And so, I like this. I tell people, I go home every day with work still on my desk. There is still more to be done every day, and I choose to leave it there, and I choose to trust, we're going to be okay. And I'm going to show up the next day, and I'm just going to do the things that I can do. And I'm not going to let, some of that, again, is choices to frame these things properly in our head. Another teaching that really resonated with me that I reference all the time to our staff, because I always want to keep this idea in front of us that it's okay that we can't solve every problem. We have to maintain balance, and we have to recognize our place in it. And in Scripture, in John, there's a story where Jesus goes to the pools of Bethsaida, and there was all these people who had ailments and diseases and disabilities who would go there because there was a belief that when the waters stirred, if you got in the waters, you would be healed. Okay, so in the story, what happens is Jesus shows up to this place where there's dozens or maybe hundreds of people with ailments waiting to be in the water, and he walks up to one man and heals him and then leaves. What about all the other people? Jesus walked past all these other people who needed help, who had true needs, and he didn't heal them. He didn't save them. And within that story, it's this idea that like, well, it's not kind of a happy ending, but it's a reality that we choose to recognize that if Jesus didn't help everybody, then I have to be okay with not helping everybody. And we have to be in tune with the needs that we need to be addressing and the ones we need to be setting aside. But you have to make those choices and maintain that balance. Otherwise, like, you'll burn out. Another side of it is more on kind of the mental health side. And living abroad and doing the work that we do comes with a lot of stress and a lot of trauma. The things that we're encountering with children and medical issues, and the place where we live isn't always the safest place. And so there's just always things happening. And we kind of say, like, you're always on. You feel like you're operating at kind of this high level of alertness and just fixing things and dealing with real traumatic events all the time. You have to recognize that, and you have to be very cognizant of the environment that you're working in, and then choose to counter that with the rest and the restoration that you need. I just heard recently that Mother Teresa, when she started her order of the nuns that were serving in Calcutta, it's a specific order of nuns, and it has its own kind of guidelines. And when she set it up, she put in the guidelines that the nuns, after 4 years, they had to take a year off of like sabbatical. So not every 7 years, like in their 5th year, you would take a year off, because she knew like the amount of weight and giving out and outpouring of people would completely just drain them, the things that they're experiencing. And so like, you need this time to recover and replenish. And the phrase, you work from your rest, you don't rest from your work. But if you're not intentional about planning that rest and planning those restorations so that then you can work from the outpouring of that, if you're not intentional, then you will rest from your work, and then you will not be ready to go back.
I guess without that intentionality, it's really easy for the next phone call, and it gets way easier to justify, well, I'll push a little harder, I'll stay a little later, and great intentions, but...
It is, and there's a balance, because there's seasons when it's like, hey, like, it's just a busy season, and there's just needs I can't say no to. And you shouldn't. I mean, especially, if you're working in a ministry setting, if you're working in a leadership setting, you have to recognize that we're dealing with people, and you can't just, oh, sorry, like, it's 5 o'clock, I'm going home, I'm sorry you're dying. There are instances when there are exceptions, but you've got to look at the norms. And so even for me, I was talking to a friend yesterday, because I've been in a season where there's just been a lot going on within my job, a lot of staff, a couple staff turnovers that we haven't been able to replace. And we actually, as an organization, we have a very low turnover rate. And just recently, a couple key positions have turned over. And it's like, okay, like, there's a season when, like, I need to step in, and I'm going to have to do a little bit more as we transition this position and bring in somebody new and move job responsibilities around. But it's to the point where I recognized, hey, I now have way too much on my plate. And I've got to start, like, we're going to come to the chopping block, and I need to be intentional about, like, rewriting what my day-to-day looks like. Because, yes, like, all this stuff has to get done, and it's hard to say no, and it's hard to stop doing things. But if I don't, like, I can't keep running at this speed, and you need the people around you who will hold you accountable to those things as well, because that's hard to recognize.
Oh, yeah. They can see it quicker than we can see it a lot of times.
Yeah.
You talked about restoration, and you talked about rest. What's worked well for you that's been helpful to kind of recharge your batteries?
My wife and I, we actually tried to sit down and, again, like, be a little intentional about what works well for us. And so, like, how often do we need a vacation? How often do we need to travel somewhere else? Get up to the mountains or get to the beach or something that's going to bring us life. That's not easy for us to do with where we live, but we know a few times a year we need to do something like that. And so we're always kind of looking ahead on our calendar of what trips are coming up. Do we need a trip right now? And knowing that happens. Another one is just, again, that work-life balance and just being cognizant of how many hours are you putting in. And because of time difference, I have to do a lot of evening calls, back to the U.S. There's recently, the frequency of those had just been increasing. And so, and again, it was like, I've got to cut this down and make sure that I only have 2 days a week where I have a call. And so even if it's a short one, I'm not going to have a couple short ones, 4 days a week. It has to be on these 2 days. And so again, it's just setting up and thinking through your schedule and creating some of those boundaries are really important. Another one, and this is a great one because it ties into, rest and leadership principles. Coming out of the church world and like having come from a church that had a sabbatical system, we brought that in to Akisa. And a little different, we say for foreign staff working there, in your third year, your fifth year, you get a 1 month sabbatical. And in your seventh year, you take a 3 month sabbatical. So I last year took my 3 month, 7 year sabbatical. We tried to be very intentional. Again, I keep saying intentional, but so important when you're a leader of preparing for that, making a plan, looking at our calendar of those 3 months and making sure like, hey, in this, I need to make sure in this first season, I'm just really kind of unplugging and resting. And then in this next kind of section, I'm reflecting. And then I'm thinking about, the repurposing and the refueling and all these different things. But I feel like people understand that aspect of like rest and sabbatical. So here's the thing that I love that applies to leadership. In organizations, generally sabbaticals aren't something, it's like, oh, if you had a big medical issue or something come up, go take a sabbatical. But in terms of taking one for rest purposes, usually not there. But let me throw in another aspect of it. I learned and saw, coming from the church world, that sabbaticals drive organizational growth. If somebody is off for a month, if you have a director or manager or senior leader who's off for a month, most of their responsibilities can be put on hold for a month. In a 3 month period, that's not the case. And so if you're going to go away for 3 months, you have to pass off those job responsibilities onto other people. And so you're training and equipping and building people up to make sure they have the capacity to do that. And then what happens is when you come back after your 3 months off, you don't necessarily have to take on all those things back. Now that opens you up to think of like, what is above me that I need to move into? What are the things I've been putting off I can work on now that these other things are, and again, it's this leadership pipeline, and it creates organizational growth. It's amazing how it works. I saw it in the church world. I saw it firsthand. And when so there was preparation going into this for me of making sure our leaders can make the decisions and do the day-to-day stuff that I do. And so when I was on my sabbatical, I was off, like not an email, not a phone call, nothing. The organization ran itself. And so, this idea of try to work yourself out of the job, like this is a preparation for that, right? And it started with me going away for a month and then me going away for 3 months. So our senior leaders got to build into some of this. But, essentially when I come back now, it's like it's freed up a little bit of my time to focus on bigger things and help the organization grow. So
so there's that self-benefit and the other's benefit of the sabbatical of you being in a good spot. They feel empowered. They feel, wow,
trust was
Jared
like a
trusted
big,
me enough to.
I heard that comment so much of we appreciate the fact that you trust us, that we'll run this, and that was a comment I heard, and it meant a lot.
At the end of the day, research points to people are desperately crying out for two things. They want more vulnerability out of their supervisor, and they want to be trusted with meaningful work. And so when you think about those two pieces of that, the sabbatical model taps into both of those.
And again, and then it's speed of the leader, speed of the team. And when you're doing this, you're creating into the culture like, hey, it's okay to rest, and everybody needs this. It's not just senior leaders; it's everybody. And that, culture, I just mentioned that, and it just makes me think, you ask learnings as I come into Uganda. So we talked a little bit about trust and kind of knowing that was going to be really important as a new leader stepping into a job. A huge learning for me is the importance of creating and nurturing culture of the organization. And again, like the culture of rest and rhythms, like falls into that, right? So every organization has a culture, and there are pre-established cultures that will come from the senior leader. And what I found is often, the senior leader is going to determine the culture. And often what happens is when a leader leaves and a new one replaces them, you realize how deep that culture is. Does it really have roots, or was it just the culture of a person? So was it just a person culture, or was it a true organizational culture? And like looking at that and looking at other organizations and seeing people leave and kind of organizations going into a little bit of disarray of who are we? And this new guy came in, and it's like, man, you guys don't have good established culture to guide you as an organization. which also helps when you're recruiting a new person to make sure they will fit within those cultural things. I read another book a few years ago, and it was called A CEO Only Does Three Things. And the three things are money, people, and culture. And so you think about like the three big buckets that you focus on as a top level leader: money and finances, right? You're responsible for the organization as a whole financially and success and health. People, getting the right people on the bus, idea. And then culture. And it's like, man, like no one ever talks about that like as a big three. But that book just really helped me to identify how much emphasis and time and focus and nurturing that a senior leader needs to put into creating culture in order for it to take roots, because otherwise it will go with you and the new person will bring in a new one. So talking about values and making sure the values of an organization, our core values that guides us, that makes us unique, are established, and they are the things that guide decision making throughout the organization. Our team values, and what do we value in terms of how we treat people and how we trust people and how we rest, the kinds of people that we want on our team, the way that we hire, the way that we promote and reward people. Those are, again, our cultural choices, right? Aspirational values of where you're heading, but if you have to give time and focus, and the way that I find it playing out a lot is just being cognizant and intentional about talking about culture with the organization. And we say the word culture all the time because I want to pinpoint that, hey, these things are culture. Let's recognize them. Let's talk about our values. We make these things part of everyday conversation.
Normalizing it.
Exactly. And calling it out like, hey, we're talking about this right now because I want it to take roots, and literally saying that in a meeting, I want this to take roots into the organization. And it just like brings attention and brings focus to, oh, okay, I get what we're trying to do here amongst our teams, that this is a huge part of the organization.
You want to empower people to, when Jared's not around, when Jared's on his 3-month sabbatical or he's home with his family, like you want your team to be carriers of the culture, right? You want them to be promoting that and growing that in the organization. But it starts at the top. It's like, I need to make sure it is crystal clear and continues to be ongoingly top of mind. It's not something I can say once a year at annual meeting. It's like, I've got to weave this into every single day in some way, shape, or form. Culture is on top of everyone's mind. I'm talking about this because I want this to take roots. It's like, okay, that normalizing that is so powerful.
When you said, people want autonomy, right?
Totally.
You said, now, again, the reason why most leaders don't give autonomy and decision-making power to their subordinates, they don't trust them to make the right decisions. Well, if you've given people a framework and a culture of how to make decisions, it's so much easier to let that go, right? And again, it's one of the questions that has come up with our staff and our directors that work below me. And they're like, are you sure, you trust me to make these decisions? And again, I just come back, how we make decisions here. How, when I'm making a decision, the things that I consider to make that decision. And so because that, I trust you to make the decisions. If you use that framework and these value systems and these things, you're 95% of the time going to make the right decisions. And if you make the wrong decision, it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
It's
At
okay.
least you're pursuing our culture.
Exactly.
And that's okay.
Yeah. And so, it's okay. I make some bad decisions. It's okay. Everything can be fixed. Yeah. Everything can be fixed, so give people, but you can't just release authority and autonomy to people without giving them some way to know how we make decisions here, what right decisions look like, what wrong decisions look like.
You don't want to delegate from a stance of laziness. You want to delegate for purposeful reasons. Hey, you can do this. We can multiply the impact here. We're going to be able to help serve more kids if you're
and again, it's organizational growth. And so if you don't delegate authority and autonomy to people, you will never grow.
It's a great segue into, I know early on when I finished the book, I sent you a copy. Let's transition to that.
So the book, and looking at, this playbook, I think I love the way that you set it up because it makes it just very simple. When you talk about mental health, and you bring up that word to senior leaders and directors and executives, it's like, oh, that's for HR, right? And that's for the counselors.
I didn't sign up for that.
And that's for the psychiatrists. And like, yeah, we want people to have good mental health, but other people help them get that. Again, mental health falls into organizational culture in a way, because the things that you establish within your organization will affect people's mental health, their work-life balance, the way that they, are able to vocalize frustrations and challenges in their life, the trust that exists amongst staff, that as their real relationships where, hey, when I'm struggling, I know there's other people around me who are going to check in on me. And so I feel valued, and I feel that my workplace is a place of relationship and a place of life, and not just a place where I come and check in and check out. So these cultural aspects of the organization will greatly impact mental health. And I think this is an easy thing for us to recognize, that this is as senior leaders, this is our role. It's not to be the counselor, right? It's not to be, the leader of the trauma group and those kind of things. But our role is to create this environment where mental health is valued, and that we have a culture that creates and works to have strong mental health. Now, you have your practical things underneath there in terms of policies of like mental health days and time off and those kind of things. And those are what they are. And those aren't hard things. And we can just choose, yes, we're going to have something, or no, we're not going to have something, giving people access to counseling when they need it, those kind of things. But the bigger part for us is that cultural aspect. And the book is great because it's just like, hey, yes, this is important. And yes, you can play a role in this as a senior leader. And here's some just really practical things and topics that you can bring up with your senior leaders. And again, allow it to flow down through your organization, no matter how big or small it is. And I think, looking through the playbook, it just came to mind of, you could be intentional and say, hey, we're working through this play right now. And what that looks like is everyone gathering together to have a conversation about this. But it can also just be a lunch meeting, very casual, like, hey, we're all going to go out to lunch as a leadership team, and we're just going to chit chat about this stuff and get people's feedback about how do you feel about this? How do you feel we're doing about this? And it can be much more informal, but it shows, hey, this is something we still value and we're still going to talk about. So it makes it very accessible.
Super portable, and that's the goal of it. I think there's a part that senior leaders can play. It's not as scary. It's things that people are already thinking and fearing, and all of us have our own spot in that journey of where we're at with our mental health. And so, man, statistically speaking, it's amazing. There are people who they would attribute to their mental well-being on the good side or the bad side, more to their supervisor than their spouse, than their therapist and their doctor. But it makes sense when you think about how many hours we spend. And also, not everybody, but a lot of people, they're in a field they're passionate about. It's like this. There's a part of me that this is my calling. This is where I'm choosing to spend all these hours, yes, to provide for my family, but it's also coming from a place of like fulfillment. And so the supervisor plays an incredible role. And there's such an opportunity there you don't have to be the therapist. You don't have to be the group trauma person. It's just, hey, let's just normalize this. Like, I'm having a pretty hard time right now. I had a season where boom, boom, boom happened unexpectedly, and I just kind of wanted to kind of get that out there, and that kind of touched on some of the open communication.
Yeah, and vulnerability.
In the playbook. Yeah. And there's just an element of that that's like, if you can create a culture to where that's not stigmatized, work should be a spot, and the supervisor gets to decide this, I think you're going to have the best retention. You're going to have the best engagement if people can really feel safe to talk about these things that are hard.
Which then leads to higher profits and outcomes.
Results will follow,
right?
For sure.
And again, it's like when you have a healthy team, that trusts each other, that works well together, that they have good mental health themselves, they will be more productive, So if that's your motivation as a senior leader, then fine.
If you're a numbers guy,
let it be the motivation. Yep. But at the end of the day, no matter what you're doing, whether you're in ministry, whether you're in for-profit business, whether you're working at a Fortune 500 company and stock price is your driving factor, people are who you work with.
Yep.
And we have to take care of our people. And if we pursue that as senior leaders of investing in our team, my job is to make sure that you have everything that you need to do your job well. That you have the right team, that you have the right resources, that you have the right work environment. Because if I can do that, you will be the most productive. Then the company will flourish and succeed either by the numbers or either by the ministry impact of the lives that we're changing. That is our focus as the senior leader. The focus is not the numbers. The numbers are outcomes and metrics of the deeper health of the organization. And so if we focus on that, the fruit will bear. When you're gardening, you worry about the health of the tree. If you worry about the health of the tree, the fruit will be healthy. My focus can't be on oranges. My focus has to be on the tree and the roots and the branches. So.
What I find with people, if you're just willing to be honest and open, it's like people will meet you in that. And then let's say worst case scenario, someone brings up something traumatic or hard or, whoa, what a perfect opportunity for you to validate and be like, man, the fact that you felt safe to share that, that's incredible. I really think there might be someone else that I would love to encourage you to go, to point to. So again, as a supervisor, your voice carries so much weight. And so in that person's moment of vulnerability, they share something, you're a trusted voice that can point them to a key next step.
Yeah.
And if that's the only part you play in them getting healing, but it has to start with that environment of trust, or they're never going to feel comfortable saying
And again, like you said, count that as a win. Like the fact that they trusted you, that shows you have done your job as a senior leader. Your job is not to fix everyone, right? And sometimes you can, and like you said, sometimes it's beyond you. But if you can't fix it yourself, it's still a win because you've done and you've created that culture and environment where people realize I can come to you. The company cares about this. You care about this. And so, super important. And again, culturally, it's just been this shift that has happened. And I think COVID had a lot to play with it. I think there's just so much learning when it comes to mental health and psychology and trauma. Everyone's talking about trauma these days and trauma-informed care and these different things because everyone is experiencing trauma, whether it be in the past, whether it be current, whether it be very small or huge and affect every day of your life. Everybody has some encounter with trauma. And, the recognition of what this really does to people from a physiological side of it, there's been a ton of advance in research. I find it fascinating, some of the stuff that's coming out and how, because there's often this thing of in the church world, you just need to pray harder and you have anxiety because of these things. And you just need to get it together. You need to pull up your bootstraps and kind of this culture of just put it off has been there for a long time. And America is a culture that has, been largely driven by results and productivity and working hard and working 70 hours a week. And no, that is not what, and we're realizing that is not what winning looks like, right? And there has been a shift, and now there's a lot of critique when it comes to younger generations, and these people just don't work. And, I need a mental health day because my cat, had to get a shot and she's in a lot of pain and I need to sit with her to comfort her because of the shot she got. And it's okay, we're swinging the pendulum a little too far here, but let's recognize again that we're humans living a life that is difficult and people have things that are happening in their home life, and you can't just say keep your problems at home. No, they will bring them into the office, whether they're vocalizing them or not. And it will affect the trust that they have with their coworkers and their productivity and the overall culture of the organization. You got a whole team of people dealing with stuff at home. You're going to walk into a really somber office that just is depressing, And so we have to allow that to come in a little bit and recognize hey, this balance of work-life balance, not in terms of hours, but in terms of our health, is so important. And there has been a shift, and it's great to see that. And again, it's for the benefit of everybody. It's for the benefit of people. It's for the benefit of their just longevity, their productivity, the relationships, the the fruit that comes out in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and I think to summarize this, is as a top level leader, you are the gatekeeper in a lot of ways on culture. And by allowing some of the stuff I talk about in the playbook, just mental health conversations in general, it's worth you opening the gate and allowing that into your culture. It's going to do way more good than harm, the added benefit that is to your people, and just them being able to be their true selves.
Yeah.
I would love for you just to plug the ministry, to share a little bit about how they can support, where they can go to get additional information.
So the ministry is called Akisa Ministries. We're a U.S. 501c3 nonprofit, and we work in Uganda. And so we work with children with disabilities. Most of these are children with like moderate to severe disabilities, and cerebral palsy, and kids in wheelchairs, and kids with epilepsy. And what we're trying to do as our organization is serve these children so that they can thrive, right? And again, you talk about, mental health, another aspect of thriving and quality of life. And these are terms, thriving and quality of life, that we use a lot. And we want to help them thrive in families and communities. And so we do a number of different things, but ultimately what we're trying to do as an organization is really solve like two problems. One is access to services and helping children get the help and the support that they need. Uganda is a developing country, again, and the access of what children with disabilities need, services, therapy, medical, special education, like those aren't there. And so we're stepping in to provide some of that stuff, but trying to shrink the gap that exists. So we want to fill the gap, but we also want to shrink the gap, right? And the other side is stigma and discrimination. And so many children, most children who have a disability are stigmatized, and they're seen as less. They're seen as not valued because they won't go on to produce things in life, because they're not a benefit to their family, because they won't hold a good job, they won't finish school, they can't help around the house. And so we're trying to change that mindset. We're trying to change the worldview and value system of people to let them realize, hey, this is not how we determine value of people. This is a child created in God's image, and we need to see them as the image bearer that they are, regardless of their disability. And so that's what we do. We run a number of different programs. We're mostly a national staff. 90%, 95% of our staff is Uganda nationals. We have a few foreigners who work to support our staff there. But I am blessed. It is an amazing ministry. It is doing such good work. We work in a field of nonprofits, and when I see what we're accomplishing as an NGO, as a nonprofit, as a ministry, is truly amazing. The amount of impact that we're able to have, the number of children we're able to serve, and the way that a dollar goes so far in Uganda, and the way that we're able to stretch that and create an impact is just amazing, And so if you're looking for an organization to support, again, like I didn't come from a disability background. Like I never expected to be in this field, and my heart has just grown. I've learned so much about it. I love what I do. I tell people like, this is my dream job. And I never thought that would be. And you don't have to have an interest or a passion for children with disabilities. The fact is that God created children to thrive in families and communities. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it with some of the most vulnerable and discriminated group of people in the world. And we're seeing fruit, we're seeing change, and we're creating opportunities for that life change to happen. And then on top of that, we're taking those learnings and we're turning it into resources and trainings for other organizations to help them also get into this area of disability and to do something. Because the need is huge. The need and the amount of children with disabilities globally who are falling through the cracks is so great. And so us as a nonprofit, we recognize we can't do this. We can't do it ourselves. We can't help every child, but let's, do some of that exponential impact with helping other organizations. And so it's a great organization to check out. Our website is Akisa, EKISA.org. You can find out about what we do there.
Well, thanks for sharing a little bit of your story and taking the time.
Yeah, it was great.